Hello.
Good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
Okay. Let's see if I got this right here.
Make sure you can hear me all right.
Yes. Are you able to hear me?
Perfectly. I hear you.
Okay.
Thank you. Thanks for taking the time today. It's a great honor. I appreciate it.
Okay. Well, I'm still a little at awe that John Lee wants to do this presentation, but this sounds exciting. So uh, let's do it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, actually, since you mentioned that, can you talk about how that all came about and just about what to expect during that evening?
I don't really know what to expect. I mean, I've been to some of his prior presentations when he I guess the last one that I recall was Harold Mayburn. Um, and Harold was supposed to be there, but he passed a few weeks prior to, or a month or so prior to, and we decided to. He was so heavy that we would just go ahead and honor him anyway, and it was great. Uh, it was just, I guess, being able. I think his main thing is just to. I guess Barry Harris used to talk about this all the time because when we would go to memorials,
Mhm.
he says, "I wish we could talk about our people before they got away," you know. And so I think this is an effort to acknowledge people and their efforts so they can enjoy it. Uh, uh, Instead of which is not meaningless, but to them it is in a sense. The only people that I guess the families or what that are involved.
Mhm.
But yeah, so that's kind of what that is, and I guess it'll be. I don't know what he's done or who he's acquired to come in to do this. Um, but it's usually players who um, have a real connection as opposed to just having a couple gigs with somebody.
Right. Cool. Great. Well, so the article I'm writing is obviously in conjunction with that, but also I wanted to just get some details, just about your career. Um, and I believe you grew up in Sacramento. Is that correct?
That's correct. Let's see, if I can get you a little larger. Is there a way I can do that?
I think in the box, in the corner of the box, on the top right, there might be three little dots.
Oh, right, right, okay. Uh-huh. Oh, that was me. I don't want me. I want you.
Let me see if I can figure it out for you. Hold on.
Exit full screen.
Maximize.
I'll do you. You
Yeah,
know. Can we do both full screen or?
you can. Yeah, I think you can. There's three options, I believe, that you can play with. There's a I see you right next to me on my screen. Let me see.
Yeah, that's how I was. I was just hoping it could be a little larger. I can see both of you now. Okay. I was just. I can see my screen too on top of that. So
Okay.
that's good. No problem.
All right. Great. I know doing this in this format's always a little strange sometimes. Um, so Sacramento. Tell me about sort of your early upbringing in terms of when you first became introduced to music.
Well, I was introduced to music before I even knew what music was, primarily in um, when I was really young. And I was born in Atlanta, Georgia, and we moved to California after I was, what, 5 or 6, actually, probably closer to 6 or 7. I really don't recall. But I've been told that I used to bang on pots and pans in the kitchen before I could even talk much, when the radio was on and it was music or something, and I
Right.
would react to that. Um, but there was always music in the house. My mother played piano well enough to play hymns in a church, and my father was an amateur pianist who I didn't really get to know until I was 18, 19 years old. They had divorced, and but my I had a sister who died early, who was older than me, but she was a singer and she played piano and she danced. And my two older brothers, who were basically 10, 11 years older than me. So I didn't really know them until, I'm 10 and they're 20 and 20, 21. So, um, but one of was a tenor saxophone player, my oldest, and I have one brother now, and he's 10 years older than I, and he's always played clarinet, but it was never he never pursued the music, and he never would improvise, but he always could play the clarinet really well, and I guess he quit for a while, and then he started back up again. But it was mainly you could just read that, read the music and play in church and do stuff like that. But I'm the only one who's tried to persevere career, you know.
Okay. And was there jazz being played in the house, or when did you first come?
Well, even back then, I didn't really know when I was really young. But in California, yes, my brother gave me an album. I was listening to all kinds of music at that time. I didn't know what. I mean, I wasn't discerning what classical music, jazz, or pop music was at that time. Pop music at that time was still "Love Is a Many Splendid Thing" or something from a movie or some melodies from movies and stuff.
Sure.
Um, um, Little did I know that the heavy cats were actually playing some great music at that time. But I didn't know. But my brother gave me when I was 15 an album of Miles Davis, "Walking," and that's when I got a chance. And I was playing trumpet. I had no idea what they were doing, but I loved it, and I would try to sing along with them, and tried to play along with it, but not really, but literally not knowing anything. But somehow I wore the grooves off of that record. So, and that was the beginning. And then I got into the military. So that's uh, right after that because I was going to get drafted. So
Right. And in the did you were a musician in the military? Did you play?
I was a trumpet player
And
in the
uh,
Air Force.
so, how did you make the transition from trumpet to bass?
Well, I'm pretty much self-taught. I was in a band in high school with accordion, saxophone, trumpet. I was the trumpet player, bass, and drums. And every time we rehearsed or we took a little break, I would just gravitate over to the bass and mess with the strings and feel the. And I think, in retrospect, I think that was my first infatuation of the instrument. So when I got into the military, the trumpet was my instrument, and that was my job in the Air Force. And so I began to just teach myself the bass when we were off, pretty much every morning from noon to midnight. I could have the band room all to myself, and there was a bass there, string bass, um, and I had a book and a Bob Haggard book. It's a very old, uh, but it had some pictures of where you put your fingers, and that's how I got started. And then it just got more into it. Uh, uh, listening, and then I got a chance to play in a band in Montgomery, Alabama. That's where I was the first bass that I was in, and learning music off the jukebox.
Mhm.
And I got in a band playing the bass, electric bass. Of course, I wasn't strong enough, or wasn't. String basses didn't have pickups and all that stuff at that time. We're talking like uh, mid '60s now.
Yeah. Okay. So then, so when you started to play the bass, I'm sure you started to dig into some bass players. Who were some of your earliest influences on the bass?
Well, the very first one was that record was Percy Heath that was on that recording that my brother had given to me, but I still didn't know who that was. And at that time, I was started in the military. We could go to the PX and we could get recordings fairly cheap, and every time I saw an album cover with a bass on it, I just bought it. I didn't even know who they were, you know. And then so I think that's how I got a Mingus record, and Ray Brown, and I began to really listen. Ray Brown was really messing me up, And then when was I? I was in after I left Montgomery. Well, actually, prior to going to Japan, which was my next base,
Mhm.
I used to go to these dances in Birmingham, and they were to a club, and people were dancing, and on the jukebox was Horace Silver's Senior Blues, and a serious bass line. I said, "Wow, what is that bass? What is that?" So I would go over to it, and I figured, and then I began to realize Horace Silver, he's on that first record that my brother gave me, and then all of a sudden stuff started to click
Hmm.
in terms of names,
Right. Right.
identifying uh, people, and when I went to Japan, that's when it all kind of broke loose. That's when I uh, saw. Well, prior to going to Japan, I saw Bobby Blue Bland, I saw James Brown, I saw Ike and Tina Turner's band. I mean, up front, I mean, it was powerful. It was amazing. So in Japan, I got a chance to see uh, the real players. I mean, that's when I saw Duke Ellington's band live, and Modern Jazz Quartet,
Mhm.
Horace Parham. Uh, Toshiko was really a star at that time. She was playing in a band, and I saw Philly Joe and Louis Bellson and Buddy Rich and Blue Mitchell. I said, wow, So in Japan at that time, and it still is, but it's different now. But I mean, uh, uh, there was music all the time, heavy duty. And so I was listening, buying a lot of records. Um, and Ray Brown was the first time when I saw him live. I said, that's it. That's what I want to do.
Yeah. Well, can you just so I'm in the process of finishing up Ray Brown's biography.
Ah,
So since you mentioned Ray Brown, I might as well ask you a little bit about him. Did you have a connection with him? And just
I
talk about
I
it.
did it. It was a very uh, to me it was very significant uh, in the scheme of things. I'm sure it was, um, but I met him in Japan after one of his concerts, and in Japan we talk about these 5,000 seat auditoriums,
Right.
and they were all after the concert. I'm in the back uh, in the back of the building where they come out. The artists come out, and there was a ton of people for autographs.
Hmm.
And so he and the trio comes, he and Oscar Peterson, and they go nuts. And he sees me, um, who I didn't look Japanese, and I was a head above most of them.
Right.
And he had his bass, and he came down and he says, "Here, hold this." And I, and he began to, sign autographs, and that took a while. Um, and then after it subsided, he said, "Give me my bass. Who are you?" And that's where we began. I said, "Well, I'm in the Air Force band, and I studying bass and trumpet." He said, "Come and walk with me to the hotel." Wow, you know.
Oh yeah.
So eventually, I got the nerve. I said, "Can I have a lesson?" Not knowing what his schedule is. He says, "Well, be at the hotel tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock." Wow. I was there at 9, you know,
Sure.
ready.
Yeah.
And I stayed with him about an hour. We didn't really, he's, and what was kind of mind blowing, I was really excited, and finally I called him up and he said, "Come on up." And we went. I came down the elevator and I could hear the bass in the hallway, you know, toward the room. And he's sawing away with the bow, playing scales and stuff. I said, "Ray Brown's playing scales? Wow." So I get to the room. He said, "Come on in." Man, he puts the bow down. We talk for a minute and tell him what I'm doing. And then eventually he said, "Well, play something for me." I didn't know what I was doing. I guess I walked the blues or something. I really don't know, to be honest. Um, and then we talked, and he says, "Have you ever done anything with two fingers?" I said, "Well, no." I said, "You work on that, because that's what a lot of people are doing that now. So develop that, you know." Um, and then I left. Um, but he always said, "Keep the bass up front. We're in the back, but keep the bass up front." And for a long time, I didn't really
Yeah.
quite know what that meant. But Ray Brown always kept the bass up front,
Right.
no matter what he or who he was playing with. And it was always prominent and
Right.
huge. Um, and so that was the beginning. And eventually, I guess fast forward, I get out of the military, and I then eventually I was in Seattle for a while, and then I went to Northwestern. And I got accepted to the university in Chicago, um, in Evanston. So that's when it began, and that's where Eddie Harris lived. And I had been listening to his records.
Right.
And when I was in Japan, Ron Carter, man, was killing this album with Cedar Walden, Billy Higgins, The End Sound. I don't know if you know that record,
Right.
but
Yeah.
that was the original Freedom Jazz Dance, and I just wore that record out. And but Chicago was the one where I got a chance to actually play. I was in school playing in the orchestra, trying to understand what that is.
Mm.
But the city, both on the south side and the north side, there was a lot of great music and musicians for me to play with. And Chicago was huge for me. That's when things really began. And I was playing all the time.
Right. And was it with Eddie Harris? It was a lot of electric bass, correct? When you started to work with him.
Both. I was at that time. I didn't care. I was doing both. You
Right.
know, because I played electric bass, kind of like a Chuck Rainey or a James Jamerson from the Motown kind of. When the bass, that animal changed to the finger popping and snapping, and it kind of lost me. I mean, I tried, um, and I kept it up. I guess my last recording with electric bass was with Jack DeJohnette playing a reggae piece, but that was it. He wanted me to continue to do it and put the up right away, and Eddie did too at the time. But um, I never really quote unquote had to play the electric bass in order to work.
Right.
So that was great.
So how did you meet Eddie Harris after being somewhat of a fan?
Well, knowing about him, and then somebody told me he lived in Chicago, so I began to found some people who knew his telephone number, and I called him, and I said, "Man, I really like your music, man. I hope." And he evidently he heard me play or heard about me from some of his friends at a jam session, and uh, he says, "But you're in school right now, all right?" I said, "Yeah, yeah." He says, "Well, you stay in school, get your degree. All this stuff will be out here.
Mm.
Don't worry about it, you know. And if I can use you when you get out, we'll do something." And that really kind of messed me up because I was ready to quit school to go with him, you know. And my wife said, "Are you out of your mind?" You know. But Eddie was one of those type of guys that I really feel he was probably the most influential person in my entire career uh, on a lot of levels, you know. But he didn't want just a bass player. He wanted, if he wanted me, he would call me because, and he did. He says, "Well, you know, you're playing. You said you liked my music."
Mm.
Because he was with Atlantic Records at that time, and he was actually quite busy. And a lot of people were wanted to play with him so they could become maybe more famous or something. I don't know, but he didn't. He didn't like that. He didn't. He could sense people were not sincere enough, which was very interesting to me. You know.
Yeah. Wow. It's great. So did you tour with him as well, or mostly was just
Oh yeah, almost 5 years.
great?
I
And
made three or
while,
four albums.
oh yeah. And while you were in Chicago, there was a session with Dexter Gordon, if I'm correct, right? Where you
Dexter and Gene Ammons.
right.
Um, and he almost didn't remember it after years went by, you know, because he always came back to the States periodically before he was basically back. Uh, uh, um, and yeah, it was always, but see, the Jazz Showcase, I got a chance to play with everybody. I mean, as a house bass player, I mean, that was my school. That was when I got a chance to, and most of those guys were so much older than I didn't, you know. So I said, well, let me go get an album because this must be representative of what they're looking for.
Mm.
So, and then um, Moody, Illinois Jackhead, Kenny Dorham, McCoy, um, oh man, Bobby Hutcherson, Harold Land, uh, you name it. It was Joe Henderson. It was an amazing time for me. Roy Haynes. I didn't play with him enough, but I would have liked to.
Sure. And
But Chicago was the really turning point because a lot of people from New York and from California were coming.
okay. So they were just you were the house bass player at the club, and they were
Right,
just kind of
the Jazz Showcase. Yeah.
great, cool. So then I think not far after your time with Eddie Harris, or maybe even during, you published your book, the Evolving Bass book.
Right. Well, Eddie Harris was responsible for that.
How
You
did
know,
that?
we were riding in the car, you know, back then we were traveling from week to week to gigs and whatnot. And I had done this workshop Uh, and that was my first introduction to Jamie Ebersold. Um, and he said, "Do you want?" Because he heard me play with Eddie Harris, and he says, "How would you like to do a clinic?" I didn't even know what a clinic was, a workshop. Hadn't thought about that. So I went, and there were these young bass players, and they were really young. They didn't. I had Ray Brown's book,
Hmm.
which I could barely play a lot of the stuff,
Sure.
but he had no verbiage in his. There was nothing
Right.
in his book, and for younger players to latch a hold of. So I ended up writing little exercises for these kids. So then I'm in the car with Eddie Harris, and I'm bitching. I said, Eddie Harris. Ray Brown doesn't know. I just sold 25 of his books for him. And Eddie said, "Well, write your own book." I said, uh, "Well, what do you mean?" He says, "You're intelligent, right?" I said, "Yeah." "And you're a college graduate, right? Right? And you're playing with me and recording on Atlantic Records." I said, "Right." He said, "Write your own book." He said, "But you must do two things." And he said, "You must finish the book, because most people don't finish things."
True.
And then he says, "You must own the book." And at that time, I had no idea of how profound that statement was in terms of, being totally in control of it. And so in 1974, well, when we were traveling in 1972, I began to put stuff down, and eventually came up with something, and it came out in 1974. Um, and it's still out here. It's still on the market,
Sure.
which is kind of amazing still. Um, and then Ray Brown was very, very supportive, because he was since you're looking into him or writing about him, he was a hell of a businessman.
Oh yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so but he he was always advocating for the players, because he was one of the first people, to my knowledge, that because there used to be the Oscar Peterson Trio had a workshop up in Canada,
Toronto, right?
and so he published his own book with his own money. He wasn't one of the, and that was impressive to me that I found. And so he said, uh, "You need to invest in yourself," And he said, "Blah blah blah blah." And I showed him my book, and he said, "You're one of the few who listened to me." And I said, "Wow." He said, "I've been watching you. I've been listening and hearing." He was. We weren't real friends, but knew each other, and every time he saw me, I was either with Eddie, and then eventually I went with Dexter, and we would play opposite each other on certain festivals. And then he saw me playing with JJ, and he would really be when he says, I'm keeping an eye on you." So it was always a very cute, but really really nice, good feeling, because he was um, very inspirational to me on a lot of levels. But the business wise, it was really interesting. And he says, "Good." It wasn't like, "Oh man," because I gave him a book. I wanted him to have. I said, "You're one of the reasons I was able to do this." And he was very supportive. So that's how that happened.
Now, remind me. I think I'm correct in it. Your book has shows you how to put the bass on an airplane. Is that?
The novelty of that book, yes.
Yes. So
I had pictures from United Airlines. A friend of mine, because I was living in Chicago at that time, we called up. there was a plane that not being used, and we got the permission to go on the plane, and I put the bass upside down in the bulkhead and all this kind of stuff. So a lot of bass players got on the plane. They said, "You can't come on here with this thing," and then he would have a ticket for it, But then he would have the book, and he'd open the book. See, it's United Airlines, and then they let him go.
I'm smiling because that was my experience when I had to travel. I mean, now you can't anymore, of course, but
no, you can't. You almost can't get in the seat yourself.
But yeah,
you're a bass player too, huh?
Oh yeah. So I teach. I'm the bass professor at Monmouth University.
Oh, that's right. You did say that. Yeah, right.
So yeah, that's my primary is the bass. But yeah, so I had the book and I said, "No, you can do it. Look, it says right here." And I had the ticket, and I was doing like a cruise ship thing, and I had to travel. So, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of great information musically, but that particularly.
Well, I mean, I wanted things that were practical, things that we had to deal with on a daily basis, not just being able to play the bass, but as a traveling professional, there were things that, and that was one that was very perplexing to for folks, and it worked until it didn't.
Yeah. I mean, it was a great, in conjunction with Ray's book, your book, because his is a lot of exercises and quite technically challenging for
yes, exactly.
Even for myself. I mean, there's still some things, those tenths and everything. But those two books, yours and his, were very important early on, and still are. I use them with my students. Great, so thank you for it.
Thank you.
So after Eddie Harris, or maybe I don't know if it was exactly after, but I think it was the next big move with Thad Jones and Mel Lewis Orchestra.
Eventually, I would move here to the New York area, and I had met the band. Obviously, had heard them before, and then they came to Chicago, and George Mraz was still playing in the band, and I had met Thad maybe, I don't even recall, 6 months or so at a festival in Kansas City, and I got a chance to play with him, and he says, you need to come to New York. And so I said, well, I'm working on it, I hope we save enough money and blah 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 blah. And we would play, and then he said, okay, let's go get some ribs, so then when the band came, he told Mel, he said, this is the bass player I was telling you about, blah, 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 blah. And so Mel said, well, actually, this is George's last tour. And I said, well, I plan to come up to New York to kind of look around. And he says, well, just let me know, and maybe you can play one night with us, And so I did that. I came to New York, just kind of, and stayed at a friend's house in Brooklyn, and we began to, and so I told Mel that, and he says, well, why don't you come and play with us on Monday night? But we got a concert on Sunday. Can you do that? I said, yeah. Is that a trick question?
Yeah.
And of course, the rehearsal was on the bus, looking at the part, and of course, there were a few of the charts that were bass heavy, and one was what was it called? You probably know it. The bass and trombone duets, or bass line. What's the hell name of that one? I thought I would never forget that one, because I mean, it had a lot of notes in it, and it was beautiful. It'll come to me in a second. And that was the first thing he called. Tiptoe, tiptoe.
Oh, yes, yes, yeah. Okay.
And so,
Oh, wow.
and so it was a test. Uh, and from that moment on, and it came back. And then when we did decide to move, which was about a year later after that, Bob, oh, another bassist from Texas actually was playing. And then when I got here, I called Mel, and he says, "Well, we got so and so here now." And I said, oh, "Okay, no problem." But 2 weeks later, he said he wanted to go back to Texas, and the gig's yours if you want. So in a sense, I hadn't played in New York
Mm.
until Monday night with the big band. So I kind of just appeared.
Right.
And I think a lot of people would say, where the hell did he come from? Who is that? But the credentials were set, because if you were in that band, you could swing
Hmm.
and you could read music and you could follow a conductor, and everything was. And I met the upper echelon of the players, just like that.
Right.
And so that was the best thing that ever happened to me in terms of uh, coming to this area.
Hmm. And was it around? So then you got involved with William Paterson, I think, around that same time.
Yeah, it was because Thad was like an artist in residence at
Okay.
William Paterson. The program had not become a program yet, but he was the coordinator of that program. His name was Dr. Martin Krivin,
Hmm.
Krivin. He was the visionary of the program, of wanting to have a conduit to the New York, city,
I see. Sure.
and that's where it all started. And so Thad um, would come out, and he would actually piss a lot of the other faculty members, the regular faculty, because he would come out pretty much when he felt like it. But and the regular teachers didn't understand. I mean, the transformation of the jazz, you know, they had no clue. And but he left, and he was already being wooed a little bit and doing things in Denmark with the Danish radio band,
Yeah.
and so he kind of left. Even Mel didn't know he was leaving.
Mm.
After a while, it was like a bad marriage. They didn't talk to each other too much. So he calls me. Martin Krivin calls. He says, "Have you seen Thad?" I said, "No. What? Why?" He said, "Well, school has already started. He should be here." And I said, "Oh, I don't know." He said, "Well, can you come out and help us?" I said, "No, I don't really want to. I didn't come to New York to teach. I came to play, and I was." He says, "I know, but I was observing you, because when Thad was there, Harold Danko and I and Mel, we would come out and do master classes
Hmm.
for almost 2 years, once a semester. So this guy was observing all of us, but he was observing me, unbeknownst to me, and that was the beginning. And so I went out. I said, "Well, I'll give it a try." And the next thing I know, I was already there 4 or 5 years, and the next thing I was saying, I have been there about 6 years. My wife said, "You've been there over 10 already," and blah blah blah. And then it went to 20, and the program really had evolved, and I enjoyed it. Um, it was great. It was challenging, but Dr. Krivin, he gave me my head. He said, "Well, let's try this. Let's try this. Let's try that." And the stuff that worked, we kept. The stuff that didn't work, we moved. Um, and to this day, it's still flourishing
Sure.
well. Um, um, but when I left, I immediately uh, joined the BMI Composers Workshop because I was getting, my wife wasn't too happy with, I was gaining a lot of weight, and I was what do you call it, juggling. I was I was still playing a lot. I was going to Japan with J.J. Johnson, going to recording, and going out to the school. And even though it got kind of crazy, actually,
Right.
I never dropped the ball, but I was. And she says, you don't look good. You really don't look good. And then I think the turning point was we went to see Milt Hinton.
Mhm.
He was 85, and he had to stop playing because he physically there was some things not happening with him, and I was 55, and I said, "Wow, I don't want that to happen to me." And I said, "Hmm, I'd like to mess with." I always said, "Man, I really would like to study some composition," but I didn't know what that meant. I was just talking.
Right.
And so my wife says, "Well, why don't you just, you've been there 20 years, stop." And I did. And the next September, I was part of the BMI workshop, and it just blew my head off, uh, information wise. And,
Right.
it was pretty amazing time. I have no regrets about the teaching. I still do residencies all over the country, and I enjoyed that very much. But and I had a great time at William Paterson, so it wasn't because I had the support
Right.
from internally, and I think that's you have to have some support that people believe in what you're doing, you know, and so it was good for me to see that you were uh, part of the school there and in a good position,
Yeah. I mean, I'm an adjunct there, but it's definitely, even with that. I know exactly what you're saying. It is a juggling act that it's tough to manage. Gigging.
Yeah,
I run my own school, like a music school in town here. So but you have family and you do,
right,
do what
right,
you.
right. You
But
do
it'd be
what
much more fun
what
than
you,
just doing this all day.
yeah, sure.
But great. So during that period when you're juggling, I guess this is the early '80s. More and more opportunities, I would imagine. Acoustic jazz is kind of coming out of that fusion era somewhat, and you're working with Art Farmer, Kenny Burrell, Frank Foster, Kenny Barron, you name it. Um, what was that period like? Like, how did you manage to do both?
Well, it was it's hard to explain. I managed it because it was fun. And we would play Bradley's. I would play Bradley's. Did you ever know that club?
Not familiar, no.
Yeah. Well, there was a place in the village on University Place, and it was a piano duo room. And Bradley's was kind of a has-been pianist, but he had, it was like a pub. I
Hmm.
mean, it was just a bar, and you could have some food there. And when I first moved here, I think Mary Lou Williams was still alive. She would play there. Barry Harris would play there. Hank Jones would play there. They would play on the Spinet,
Wow. Okay.
and Ron Carter and Eddie Gomez and all. I said, wow. And then all of a sudden, when Paul Desmond died, who was a very close friend of Bradley's, willed his grand piano to the club.
Hmm.
And all of a sudden, the club just, it had the best piano in New York, better piano than the Village Vanguard and any of the other clubs at that time. And it kind of forced everybody to get a better piano, in a sense.
Yeah.
But that so I played there a lot with Kenny Barron. We would teach all day,
Hmm.
and we would come in at, we didn't start till 10.
Right.
So we kind of drag our asses in there, having taught all day and dealing with the traffic to get in there, and we would play till 2 o'clock in the morning. And I would be wide awake after at 11 o'clock because the music was so amazing. To play with him was really, but I played there a lot with uh, Tommy Flanagan, played there with Kirk Lightsey. We made a recording there. Um, uh, I mean, every piano player that you can think of would play in there. I used to see Ron Carter play in there, with a ton of people. But so that place was fantastic, and there were a lot of piano bars around. There was two
Hmm.
blocks away. There was another place, uh, and around the corner there was another place, and there was a lot of music going on and a lot of work in the city. And if you could play, you worked. Um, and So between that and the school, and then I would go out of town. Then I got a chance to play with um, JJ. I was with JJ for a lot of years. Um, in the between, there were 3 years where his first wife had died, uh, and um, then I would travel. I did 3 years with Jack DeJohnette's band, and that that was a whole. Uh, uh, I loved that, and I was just reading about him. He just turned 80, and but he made me play things that I didn't even know I could play.
Right.
It was really neat to remember. So I did 3 albums with with him, 2 albums. One was a double album, and but I was with him for 3 years, and that was so different than, it was like being in two bands with that band, because when he went to the piano, there were no drums, and so it was like a chamber group.
Right. Yeah.
And then when he played drums, it was like an animal at the drums, and then I had the whole freedom of the harmony or wherever whatever it was.
Right.
So that was fantastic for me. And so when I would sit down and play with Frank West and play some swing or Jimmy Heath or Art Farmer, man, it was, those guys play so good, and I loved playing. First time playing with Cedar Walton and Billy Higgins was the bass basically played by itself.
Yeah.
you know, it was so for me. I don't know, timing. I think is certainly uh, uh, a part of it, but I tell the players. Some of my players that are looking, I said, well, opportunities happen sometimes, you don't, when you least expect it,
Right.
and uh, you have to be prepared, and sometimes you'll see it pass right in front of you, and if you don't grab it, it's gonna go.
Right.
And I don't know what that means,
I,
except you have to be prepared to do what it is you think you're doing.
right. And it seems like versatility with you was a big part of your career. The ability to play electric, jump into different
Yeah,
types.
but the electric bass, I felt. I realized that I did not have, nor did I want to pursue. I did take a couple of lessons just to try to see if I could get it together. Um, but I didn't have to play electric
Right.
bass. Whereas, and as you know, there's still a handful, literally a handful of bass players who can really play the electric bass like electric bass players play,
Right.
and can really play the double bass like
Yeah.
double bassists can play.
McBride,
Stanley
Tucci.
McBride, Stanley Clark,
Right.
Brian Bromberg, uh,
Hmm.
uh, with, Patitucci.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a small handful of players who really will make you listen,
It's true.
uh,
Yeah.
and because especially now, there's another Anthony Davis. You know
Oh yeah.
Anthony?
Sure. Uh-huh.
Boy, he can really play the electric bass, and he can play. He and I were at Northwestern. He studied with Warren Benfield on
Mm.
double bass. A lot of people don't know that, but he can play too. Both of them. He's a real kind of a quiet kind of guy.
Right. Yeah. So also in there, I think I mean you mentioned J.J. Johnson, big part of you, working with him. What was he like on a personal level, J.J.?
It's funny you ask because you know how we have our heroes. Like
Yes.
Ray Brown's a hero, and when you put him on a pedestal,
Right.
and when you meet them, they either go in the same place or higher, or they go to the basement. And JJ, first time I met him, we rehearsed. I could have gone home and not done the gig. I was so satisfied. So for me, I had to go get a ladder and put him up a little higher. He was he was a gentleman. He treated us with the utmost respect. And once we convinced him that we understood what he wanted,
Right.
then we could play whatever we wanted because he was assured. He was a very interesting man. He was a composer, as you know, but his playing it was so pristine. His the accuracy of notes, the forward motion on the trombone, particularly, it really turned a lot of people's heads. But he liked the rumble underneath. He loved Elvin Jones
Interesting.
big time. So after I began to understand that, to me, it was a compositional thing, you
Right.
know, uh, where you have these contrasts and these things that are going on. And then I began to even understand even more. So we were playing Renee Rosnes and I and Billy Drummond. This was before
Mm.
they got divorced, and Ralph Moore. Wow, unbelievable. And one time we played in Amsterdam. I'll never forget it. You go on the road and then one nighters, and you're in the hotel, and then in the next morning you see the piece of paper under the door that they, and it's the bill for you to pay the hotel or whatever. So I picked it up, and it was a note from JJ. He says, "Thanks for last night. You guys played your ass off. Love, JJ." I said, "Oh God, nobody's ever done that," and it was amazing. He was a gorgeous man, to play for and to be around. Yeah,
Great. And just one other name I wanted to ask you about around that same period. I think Stan Getz a little bit before J.J. Johnson, right?
yeah, that was really special for me too because I had played a little bit with Stan uh, when he was on and off the wagon. And Jim McNeely and I, and because Jim had played with him quite a bit, and then he would tease me about. He said, "Yeah, you know, you play with Dexter, and he was a happy drinker." He says, "I'm different, because he wasn't. He was he wasn't really a nice guy. He was okay with me because when I was with him, he didn't drink.
Mm.
He was in between whatever. And but when we did this tour, he with Kenny Barron and Victor Lewis and myself, that was like a 5 week tour, and he had a tumor that was about the size of a small grapefruit behind his lung, and they wanted him to take an operation for that, but it wasn't necessarily quote unquote life threatening. So he had this big festival thing that he wanted to do. So he said, "I'll do it afterwards, after the festival," because he was going to really make a lot of money, I think, at that time. But anyway, uh, those recordings, there's two recordings,
Right.
Anniversary and Serenity. There's one day
Hmm.
at the Club Montmartre.
Okay.
They came out at different times, and they were not supposed to be albums at all. They were live radio, video radio for the Danish radio. And then shortly after that, evidently the people at that club, because he was well loved in Scandinavia, period. But when they found out that he was dying, he was he was going to die. Somebody in Denmark got to the radio people and said, "Man, we gotta really do something. We gotta put this out." And I'm happy they did, because then they actually paid us for the albums, and which sometimes didn't happen, in situations like that. But when we got to that club, we had played 5 weeks, almost 4 weeks, a month.
Mhm.
The piano was a brand new Steinway, and Kenny said, "Man, it felt great." And the club was packed. The bass felt great. The engineer uh, was really nice, and I was relaxed. But we had a month of playing under our belts,
Right.
so we just played. And um, Stan knew what he wanted, but Victor and I and Kenny played well together. We played a lot of different situations as a trio, and also with different people. And but Stan, the golden sound. So you had to play good. You just had to play good with him. To me, his worst enemy was when he took the horn out of his mouth. You know. Uh, but musically, so a lot of people really have come up to me and said they're really like Stan Getz, nuts. I mean, they
Right.
go
Right.
nuts. But these are some of the best records I've ever heard. I said, well, I have to admit they were very wonderful, and I feel very blessed and fortunate to have been part of that. But that was a collective thing between Victor and I and Kenny and Stan. Stan was really cool. Uh, he almost didn't want to be, but he had to be because there was nothing he could bitch about.
Right. That's funny. So then, of course, you've made a bunch of records as a leader and a co-leader. Was that When did that happen? Was it an active transition that you were thinking about, or
I guess I was always thinking about it. To be honest, I had missed like Ray Brown was with Oscar Peterson, Eddie Gomez was with Bill Evans, and the closest I actually came to anything like that was with the rhythm section with Dexter with George Cables and Eddie Gladden. We did make an album, but it wasn't with George. It was with Kirk Lightsey,
Mm.
and so I guess in the back of my, I guess I wanted to be a part of something like that, more of a trio, but it just never really clicked. And then I'm not sure I really wanted to be a leader.
Mm.
And then I said, well, maybe uh, let me try some drummers. And I had a long list of drummers that I loved to play with, and but the list got shorter and shorter when you have to go into business with drummers or anyone for that matter.
Sure.
And Akita Tana and I played a lot together with Jimmy Heath, and we had always had a lot of fun. And we never talked about how to play with each other. It just happened,
Mm.
and his name always came to the top of when. And so I approached him, and he immediately said no.
Mm.
But then he thought about it, and I said, well, let's. What do we have to lose? Let's try it. So we actually had a band for 10 years. We have five uh, recordings that I'm very proud of, and he was a hell of a. He is a hell of a drummer, but he was a great. He understood being in the studio. He knew how to produce and how to uh, that posture in the studio. So I learned a lot from him in that regard. And so the last time we did something together, he was. I asked him if he would be the uh, help me do Quiet Pride, the big band album that I did. So that's how. But we were together for 10 years. It was great. We had a book. We had auditions, which was kind of funny. People were lining up to play saxophone or piano with us, and we didn't even have gigs, but we had people knew about us because we were organized. We wanted to have a group sound,
Sure.
um, and so that was fun. So and Akita and I are still very very close. Yeah.
Great. Cool. And now, how do you do you still practice on a regular schedule now? How do you normally spend your time musically?
Well, it's funny you asked that because now I'm actually fighting. I I practice with the projects and things that I'm doing.
Sure.
To be quite honest, nowadays, in fact, I was before clicking, knocking on your door. I was working on because I'm working on an arrangement uh, that I'm taking a quintet into Dizzy's October 28, 29,
Oh,
30.
excellent.
So I'm happy about that. And so I've been a couple of arrangements and of some of my tunes. Yeah, and so I'm practicing for the projects that I'm doing, which um, and I think that's how it evolves. Although I'm fighting with I'm writing a lot. I'm doing a lot of composing, which I'm really happy about as well. But not just jazz composition or per se. I just finished a string orchestra piece, uh, which I've been wanting to do for a long time. I got a commission to do it, and I think it came out pretty good. But just studying, listening to string, when you don't have horns and percussion and brass and all that kind of, just strings. It's pretty amazing what the strings can do.
Totally.
And um, uh, do you know the name Ryan Truesdale?
I do know the name. Yeah, it
Well,
sounds
he's the guy that's actually been taking a lot of the Gil Evans music
okay.
and bringing a lot of it back to life. He's connected with the Gil Evans estate, and he's got some of that music that from way back, and then he was able to put it into the computer and play some of that music, which is pretty amazing. Um, but he commissioned 16 of us to write a string quartet, not jazz per se, but jazz composers to just write a string quartet.
Mm.
And so I finished that in January. So I heard a rehearsal and it was pretty exciting.
Yeah.
With this next year, I think he's gonna come out with that stuff. So that was kind of exciting. I have 2 orchestra pieces that have been performed, but I'm working on a new big band a couple tunes of mine, because I'm going to play with the New York Youth Orchestra jazz group in March at Dizzy's, featuring my music. So that's so I'm busy doing that. So to answer your question, practicing the bass and sitting down at the piano or composing, they both require a lot of time. So I'm at button heads sometimes. So I'm just, and if I can do a little bit of each and still keep busy enough and try to make some money at the same time, it's
Very
so
good.
I don't have any dull moments at the moment. Thank you.
Right. You're busy.
Yeah.
And you're
In the
still still in New Jersey, right? In Teaneck, is that where you're?
Teaneck, yes.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
So what are you going to be doing with this article?
This is well, for the article is for Jersey Jazz Magazine. It's to sort of promote that you're being honored on the 19th. Additionally, I'm going to take your quotes about Ray Brown and and use them in my book.
Yeah. Well, he was a very special guy, as you know, and I I was in Europe when I heard about him passing in Indianapolis, but it was I liked him a lot. I watched him up close, talking about music, and he was a surrogate father for all of us. It's kind of paving the way for us, not only to play, but how to handle yourself business wise.
Yeah, he seemed very definitive in his statements and in the way he thought about. I mean, when I've only had the opportunity, I did speak with him 2 or 3 times, very briefly. I kind of didn't have a real in with him, so he just looked at me as some fan, I guess. But yeah, he yelled at me once. I went to see him at he was doing a clinic at Jersey City College, and I went to, and the traffic was like the worst traffic ever. I'm never late for anything. Of course, for this I'm late, and he recognizes that I'm late, and I had a question I wanted to ask, and you were the guy who was late. I said, well, sorry, Mr. Brown, I didn't mean to be insulting, but yeah, obviously in terms of bass, what can you say? Cool. So just finally, I mean, in terms of the future of jazz, I ask everyone this: what do you believe the future of jazz holds? What is the future?
Honestly, I think it's in great hands. The young people that I know personally, there's a lot of players coming out here. Certainly a lot more players than there is work, and where they can actually hone the skills.
Right.
Because whatever I can play I have the support of all those years of playing 6 nights a week for years.
Right.
And you can practice a lot and you can play a lot and you can become very proficient in a lot of ways, but it's the experience that I think that keeps me moving forward is what the young players don't have yet. They have the technique. I have students who play more and understand more at 19 and 20 than I even could ever imagine,
Mm.
but they don't know what to do with it,
Right.
you know. And they haven't been given the opportunity yet to let it roll out to the point where it becomes part of them. So I just would like the players to become a little more patient about showing off and just take it in and as a bass player, um, really make the band happen, because I believe when I played with Stan Getz, I could make him sound. We as a rhythm section could make him sound better than he could play with any other rhythm section. That's the way I. That's how I want to go in and do. When I work with a drummer, I we have to hook up that the piano player has no choice
Right.
but
Right.
to come with us. It has to be that way. So the players of today have such distractions, plus of of being part of the media. I mean, just what we're doing right now, is so foreign. It's more foreign to me than it is to you. And But to answer your question, I mean, when I listen to people like Sullivan Fortner or Glenn Zaleski or uh, uh, Lucas uh, Lucas Curtis, Desron Douglas, uh, you know, Nikki Parad. Um, I mean, there's a lot of and really young and middle, they've been playing a while.
Right.
I mean, Nikki, she got it next to Les Paul for a lot of years, and man,
Yeah.
you can't buy
Right.
that experience. And she can play.
Yes.
I mean, she came and studied with me before she left Australia, and I would tell her, I said, she has something really strong, and but she had to leave her own country because the females wouldn't have a chance, so she's not looking back now. But I mean, but again, to answer your question, I hear some really wonderful players: Michael Rodriguez, Freddie Hendricks, uh, uh, Jerome Jennings.
Jerome's great.
Uh, um, I've got a young drummer with me now, Kenneth Salters is his name. And these guys can play. They can read. They compose. They're doing. I mean, there's not as one dimensional as was when I was coming up,
Right.
and I think it's healthy. However, I think the young players have to, like, okay, let me get into this place, and then you can spread your wings a little bit. Get in something and let somebody know that you're in control of whatever's coming out of your instrument. And you just have to. It's a different playing field, and so I can't even. I don't know. Everything is different now, and I think the really creative players will find a way and are finding a way. You know, um, because there's a generation that's, let's say, Bill Charlap.
Sure.
No, the below him is the Glenn Zaleskis and the Sullivan Fortners and the Orrin Evans, and Orrin is a little older, but I mean, um, uh, it's different. Like in bass players, Essiet, he's not so young anymore, and they have. Um, but there's some players that are coming out that are really serious and they know their history, and so that's been encouraging to me.
No, it's great. Great answer. All right. I've kept you for quite some time. So I want to thank you. Unless you have anything else you wanted to add.
Um, just that I don't know if you're aware, but my new album, my new CD just dropped a couple days ago, called Celebration, and that's with my trio, also with the Steve Ali and Duduka Don Fonseca, and Kenneth Salter plays on two tracks, and the Sirius Quartet, which is a string quartet, and it's on Sunnyside, and I'm really excited about that one because it's actually a. Are you familiar with Nouvelle Records?
No.
Nouvelle was a company that only produced vinyl.
Oh, okay.
And so so I recorded that. I did one with Sullivan Fortner duo, which was, but before that, I did it with the trio and the Sirius Quartet, which is a string quartet. And so 2 years after it was released on vinyl, the audio reverted back to me. And so it's been 4 years now because 2 years after, and then we had 2 years of the pandemic.
Right.
So now I'm happy to say that you'll be able to hear this music because there was not a digital footprint at all. So I'm happy now it'll be more accessible. Um, and for people who want the vinyl, they can still go. Frank Kimbrough, do you know that name? Pianist that died. We did. He was the first one to actually do that, do a recording for Nouvelle, and told me about it, and that's how I got involved. And they're still producing some beautiful recordings, but it's all vinyl,
Right.
And so, so I'm happy about what's happening now, and they're realizing now. Hopefully, the people who will know more about my music and writing with the strings and blah blah blah, and I hope maybe in another year or so I can produce another CD with Sullivan and I just playing duo, and adding some, because the vinyl, you were like in the old days, you had to be careful of minutes.
Right. Yeah.
There was only so much on the one side, and we got spoiled because now people listen to everything, and most people's attention span is really after about 50 minutes, they're done, and it's got to be really good, so I'm happy about that. So
sure, I'll be sure to make mention of those projects in the article for sure.
Okay. All right. Well, it's been a pleasure. Hopefully, if you get a chance to come to Dizzy's one night, or are you going to be at the in November at the I don't know what I don't know what John was calling it, but that evening.
The evening, yeah. I plan on it as long as I don't get a really good paying gig that night.
Right. I hear you. I hear you. All right. Well, it's been a pleasure.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for your time.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.